Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. Now, this episode is releasing on a Thursday, so this is actually a bonus episode, and this is the second bonus episode I've ever done. Interestingly enough, I happen to share the other bonus episode on the exact same date 1 year ago. So the reason why I'm sharing this particular bonus episode is because I was reading this paper and I was like, I need to share this as soon as possible. So this particular bonus unpacking scholarship episode is on the paper titled, quote, I can't read, but I can code, using puppets to teach C++ to pre-readers, a quasi-experimental, critical, phenomenological mixed methods case study. And this paper was written by Ricardo Rollerstein, and it was written in the Applied Programming Readers International Ledger, Volume 1, Issue 21. And this particular article is available for free, and you can find that in the show notes by clicking on the title for the paper, or by clicking on the author's name, and you can find some more papers that this particular author wrote. So make sure you click on the link in the particular app that you're listening to this on, or by going to jaredoleary.com, clicking on the CSK8 podcast, and then clicking to sort by bonus episodes. All right, so here's the abstract for this paper. Quote, in the United States, there are hundreds of thousands of open computing jobs that are currently unfilled. Although the K-12 pipeline can prepare students for future careers in computer science, the approaches used in elementary classes, in particular, are often decontextualized from industry practices. For example, elementary students often use block-based programming languages, while industry professionals tend to use text-based languages. Given that the Fair Labor Standards Act sets the minimum age for employment in non-agricultural jobs at 14 years of age, this presents an opportunity for students ages 14 and older to fill current CS positions if they are adequately prepared in CS. To better prepare students for a jumpstart to such opportunities, this quasi-experimental, critical phenomenological mixed methods case study investigated the use of puppets to teach C++ to pre-readers in pre-kinder classes over the course of a semester. Statistically significant results, p of less than 0.01, from the study indicate that pre-K students who listened to a lecture pantomimed by a puppet were able to outperform their peers who listened to the same lecture by a university professor. The results from the study demonstrate a promising approach for accelerating the CS industry pipeline in K-12 context. End quote. All right, so if I were to summarize this particular paper into a single sentence, I would say that this paper investigated the use of puppets to teach C++ to pre-readers in pre-K CS classes. All right, so this paper begins with an introduction, and the author describes how, due to the ever-increasing demands for more CS professionals, K-12 schools need to better prepare students for work in the field of CS. So rather than taking an approach of decontextualized coding practices from industry practice, the author argues that students should learn to create with languages and platforms commonly used in industry settings. So in this particular study, the author wanted to investigate the use of C++ with Visual Studio for Windows. Now, the rationale for this particular language and platform was that if we begin teaching such languages and platforms to pre-K and kindergarten students, they are better able to develop their abilities over 13 to 14 years of schooling. So think of the 10,000-hour rule. And so this amount of time refining practices within one language and one platform would allow students to potentially skip college and possibly even begin working as a CS professional part-time at 14 years of age. So this differs from other approaches that try and scaffold programming languages in stages that align with various developmental theories. So for example, using icon-based blocks in Scratch Junior with early and pre-readers, then moving to block-based languages like Scratch, and then eventually moving to text-based languages. Now, the author cites decades of evidence to support the idea that puppets can be used to teach concepts to children, who are often in the pre or early reader stages. So for example, kids learn letters, numbers, and values through TV shows that use puppetry like Sesame Street or The Muppets, or even some advanced concepts such as how the United States handles geopolitical relationships around the world through forms of puppetry like the supermarionation techniques used in the 2004 documentary Team America. Right, so a quick summary of the intro. Basically, the author is saying that, hey, instead of waiting until students graduate from university, we could potentially find some ways to get it so that we can fill these unmet jobs at ages of 14 rather than waiting until like ages of 22. And their hypothesis is that students would be able to learn advanced languages and platforms if we taught using puppetry techniques, as evidenced in some of the TV shows and movies or documentaries that the author cites. All right, so the next section of the paper is the methods section. So in this particular study, the author describes how there were two classes of pre-K students who were classified as pre-readers. One class spent a semester watching 3-hour-long recorded lectures from the author's university. So this was the control group. Now, the treatment group used the exact same audio and screen recordings as the control group. However, instead of displaying the university instructor in the corner of the screen, a puppet pantomimed the lecture in the bottom corner of the screen. So the exact same lecture, exact same screen recording, the only difference is they replaced the university instructor with a puppet who would basically open the mouth as if they were talking and demonstrating stuff in a Visual Studio. So the pre-K students would watch 3-hour lectures each week over the course of a semester, and the control and treatment groups were compared with an undergraduate class taking the same course at the university. Okay, so both the control and treatment groups completed all assignments and quizzes for this CS 101 course. Because both the control and treatment groups consisted of pre-readers, the author used pre- and post surveys that included a mixture of emoji-based demographic questions. Also included Likert scales, where they circled emojis to indicate level of understanding, comfort, frustration, etc. And even open-ended response section where students were asked to share what they learned by drawing pictures. So the author used Cronbach's alpha to test for internal consistency of the Likert scale responses among both the treatment and control groups, and found an alpha of 0.93, indicating high internal consistency or reliability among responses. The author and multiple graduate students coded the open-ended responses and found a high inter-rater reliability with a fleece kappa rating of 0.85, indicating strong alignment. Now, the authors also collected the assignments and quizzes for the CS 101 course at their university to compare those results with the treatment and control groups in the pre-K, pre-reader groups. All assignments and quizzes from the control, treatment, and CS 101 groups were then assigned participant ID numbers before being anonymously graded by TAs for the CS 101 course. So this made it so that a TA was unable to determine if an assignment or quiz was completed by a college student or a pre-reader from the treatment or control groups. Now, this method section is very detailed, so I highly recommend going and looking at the show notes to take a look at some of the stuff that I left out in this. But hopefully I gave you enough details to share what the basic method was and how reliable or valid the results were. So results from the study indicate that the control group failed all assignments and quizzes. So this is the group that did not have the puppets. They just watched the 3-hour lectures each week. Now, this finding makes sense, given that these students were pre-readers in a pre-K class taking an Intro to CS course using C++ in Visual Studio. However, the treatment groups scored along a bell curve that matched the grades of the undergraduate students in CS 101, with absolutely no statistically significant deviations from the bell curve. So in other words, the group that had the puppet treatment or intervention scored along the same bell curve as the undergraduate class that took the CS 101 course, which that's a pretty remarkable finding. Right now, interestingly, even though the treatment group could not read, they were able to complete coding assignments with the same level of quality of undergraduate students who were at least a decade older than the students in the treatment group. Now, one of the things I really appreciated is the author includes some excerpts of the assignments and quizzes, so we could see and compare the 3 different groups, the control group, the treatment group, and the undergrad CS 101 group. And I have to say, the treatment and the 101, I could not tell a difference between the level of code that students were submitting. But there was a very clear difference with the control group. I include direct links in the show notes to those particular excerpts if you want to take a look at it. Now, speaking of the show notes, I also include direct links to the open-ended responses that the author provided. So remember, the open-ended responses were drawings that the pre-readers were able to draw to kind of demonstrate their understandings of what they learned when they took the survey. So as an example, one student used a red crayon to draw what appears to be a fire truck, which was coded by the author and the TAs as a clear example of nested conditionals, which totally makes sense. Okay, so another respondent actually drew a stick figure person and the letters J, O, and a backwards letter E, which was a misspelling of the child's name. But the authors note that it clearly demonstrated understanding of the difference between variables and constants, while also challenging the hegemonic norms imposed by the social construction of alphabets. So in addition to the surveys and the open-ended responses and collecting of assignments, the author did some follow-up interviews with students in the treatment group, asking them to explain their assignment submissions, and these video recordings of these explanations are actually linked to in the paper itself. So it's a playlist with some YouTube videos, and I'll include a link to this in the show note, because I highly recommend going to the show notes, watching the videos in the provided playlist, as they made me realize that I could have done so much more with the K-8 kids that I was working with if I had tried this approach outlined in this particular article. All right, so here's a quick summary of the results itself. So the author found that the control group failed completely, whereas the treatment group, the group that used the recorded lectures but had a puppet pantomiming things, they were able to score on par with the CS 101 undergraduate course, which is a remarkable finding. All right, so the author in the discussion section notes that the findings from this study provide a path for streamlining the K-12 to CS industry pipeline by demonstrating how children as young as pre-K can begin learning undergraduate intro to CS concepts, if you use this approach. And so the author closes with the following quote on page 4. Quote, "Given the success of using puppets to teach C++ to pre-readers and pre-K students, follow-up studies should not only investigate the effectiveness of puppets in other K-12 and higher education CS classes, but in other subject areas as well." End quote. So I think this is very important for other CS researchers to investigate. So I wish I was still in the elementary classroom to see if I could teach students advanced concepts in other subject areas using the techniques outlined in this article. But maybe we could go back and re-record all of the videos that I've done with Boot Up, and instead of having me in the corner explaining how to do stuff in Scratch, we could have a puppet do it. So that might be the next project that I'll start working on. All right, so as always in these Unpacking Scholarship episodes, including this bonus one, I like to talk about some of my lingering questions or thoughts. So one of my questions is, how might the results have differed if the puppets were singing the lines of code in a musical rather than speaking the lines of code? So the reason why I ask this is because often in these puppet shows and movies and whatnot, they're not just talking, but they're also engaging in musicals that teach a very specific concept. For example, in Team America, there is a very specific discussion on loneliness and some of the problems that come with that. Now, if they do this, they might need to consider singing in falsetto range because children are able to hear the notes and can sing along without having to transpose octaves. So in other words, the voice that I'm speaking right now is my normal chest voice, my speaking voice. But falsetto would be if I talked like this. So it's using more of a head voice. And it's the voice that I had to use when I was teaching elementary kids. When I was a general music and band specialist, it was difficult for them to transpose from my natural singing voice up to their range, just because they don't have as long of vocal cords. So if you are interested in implementing this technique of using puppets to teach concepts, perhaps you should try doing a musical and then let me know how it goes. All right, so my final question for this particular paper is, what's a similar approach we might be able to use with older students? So in particular, I doubt older students would want to learn from puppets. They might think it's too childish. So I'm wondering if we should do follow-up studies that take snippets of the pre-recorded lecture and sequence them together in TikTok to teach the same concepts using a platform that older students are already engaging with. So think about it. We could basically be engaging in edutainment by simply taking out 20-second excerpts of the pre-recorded lecture and then simply putting it in a sequence in TikTok. And then as people swipe through it, they're going to be learning advanced CS concepts and practices. I imagine this would be really helpful for filling the unmet jobs right now and getting more kids interested in computer science. All right, so with that concludes this week's episode of the CSK8 podcast. I hope this bonus episode was super helpful for you. Maybe you will consider using some of these techniques in here, but I highly recommend going to the show notes and make sure you click on any of the links in there, whether it be the author's last name to see more of their publications, the actual title of the publication to go directly to it, or any of the related links in there, such as the YouTube playlist or the example excerpts of students' code, or even the pictures of the drawings that students submitted in the open-ended responses. They are all extremely interesting, and so I highly recommend going there. Remember, you can find this by going to jaredoleary.com or by clicking on the link in the app that you're listening to this on, which should take you directly to that. If you enjoyed this particular episode, please consider sharing it with somebody else, especially on the day that it releases. Otherwise, it might not make sense. And if you don't understand why, check out the show notes. Stay tuned for another Unpacking Scholarship episode that will release on this upcoming Monday, and the following link, which will have another interview. Hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.